There were many helicopters flying above the skyscrapers. The monsters were attacking people, destroying buildings. The protagonist looked at the huge dragon, feeling some kind of connection with it. The beast's eyes emitted an orange glow. The young man stared ahead. The dragon released a stream of fire, attacking other monsters. People watched what was happening with horror on their faces. The guy looked at the bowing people, thinking that the world honored him as if he were a god himself. Behind the hero was a huge monster. The news anchor with a microphone in her hand reported that in the summer of 2224, the city zoo was attacked by a snake more than 100 meters long. A young man lay on the table, his shirt covered in blood. He saw his body from the side. The lizard opened its eyes and mouth wide. The beast turned around, not understanding what was happening. The protagonist jumped, thinking that he had turned into a marine iguana. Chinchu took off his shoes. He was a second-year university student and lived in a rented apartment. The young man walked forward, thinking that he liked cold-blooded animals for their beauty. There was a glass terrarium on the table, and Chinchu thought that a new batch of exotic pets had arrived from the pet store. Inside was a green marine iguana, which immediately attracted the attention of the protagonist. The animal suddenly jumped out of the terrarium, attacking Chinchu, who was previously sure that marine iguanas were usually affectionate. The lizard sank its teeth into the owner's hand. He grabbed the phone. Then he hit the iguana on the head with this gadget. Suddenly, the lizard hit the owner in the face with its tail, and he dropped his phone. The protagonist opened one eye. Lying on the table, he silently looked at the marine iguana. Suddenly, the lizard's paw rose while its body radiated orange energy. The student sat with his hand raised, realizing that he could control the iguana's body like a puppet. The protagonist smiled and thought that he was starting his journey as a hero. The lizard lay on its back while Chinchu tried to decide whether to sell the beast at the market or show it on live TV. The protagonist picked up the iguana by its tail and decided that he was not destined to be a hero because when other people get cheats, they become powerful, gain new powers, or a system appears. The student stood with the lizard in his hand, thinking about how he was stuck here with it. There were lights on in some of the windows of the building. The protagonist looked out the window, saying that he had not eaten anything today, after which he asked what marine iguanas eat. The lizard climbed onto the owner's shoulder, and the young man decided that regular meat should be suitable for this pet. The protagonist twirled the knife in his hand. He handed the meat dish to the iguana with a grin. Watching the lizard happily eat, the boy was glad that he was right. Suddenly, a bright blue screen appeared in front of the protagonist's face, where it was written that after eating, the iguana received 5 evolution points, and the student's physical strength increased by half a point. The boy looked at the system window and sweated, realizing that it was indeed a cheat. He raised his hand, bending his fingers. The student thoughtfully looked at his palm. He remembered how he trembled in a sitting position, while an adult man told him that without understanding the basics, practice would be useless. The man extended his hand forward, saying that the root of Chinchu's strength was in his legs, so he needed to take the right stance. The boy raised his head and asked his father to take a break. The man frowned and refused his son. The child looked at his hand and concluded that he did not want to be a coward. Then he ran in a circle, gritting his teeth. Suddenly, he tripped over a stone. He fell backwards onto the ground. The boy was breathing heavily as beads of sweat ran down his skin. His father put his hand on his side and shouted that no one would give him a helping hand in his adult life, so he should get up. The man was handing his son a small box. The father was sitting on a chair, saying that all his savings were inside and that he had to go on a long trip, so Chinchu would walk the rest of the way himself. Tears appeared in the boy's eyes as his father told him that the world was not as kind and good as he thought. The child pursed his lips, asking when he would meet his father again. The man put his hands on his knees and said that perhaps it would be when his son became a great master, if his father lived long enough. Then the man stood up and walked away. He stopped in the doorway. The door closed. The student looked at the picture of his father and thought that 10 years had passed before he realized everything. The iguana sat by the empty plate, belching loudly. The owner looked at the lizard and concluded that it ate very quickly. Suddenly, he looked away tensely. Red veins appeared on the iguana's body, and the protagonist realized that his pet was growing. When the system notification appeared, he turned around and looked at it. Suddenly, his gaze became tense. Chinchu turned around abruptly, looking at himself in the mirror. He lifted his t-shirt, saying that his body was not so fit before. The protagonist came to the conclusion that the points the iguana received affected him too. The guy looked at the lizard and thought that it could evolve if it could get more points and become huge. He imagined the huge beast from his dream. He grinned and thought that in this case, he would become a great martial artist. There were many buyers at the market. The student paid with a card, holding a gray bag in his hand. He looked at the purchases with a smile and decided that this should be enough. He closed the trunk of the car. The beige car was parked in the parking lot. Birds were flying in the sky. There were several plates with delicious dishes on the table. The guy looked at the dishes with pleasure and thought that he could become a martial artist if the iguana ate more. The lizard opened its mouth in admiration, drooling. The owner possessed the body of the iguana, which was sitting on the table, and decided that pork was not as good as beef. The protagonist looked away. Then he stretched and said that next time he would take more beef. The iguana was lying by the window, wearing sunglasses. Chichu was looking at the punching bag in the training room. His eyes widened. Then the guy punched the bag. Chinchu read the notice that after his intense training, his experience increased by 5 points, and then he smiled happily because he really felt the muscle tension. 2 days later, the protagonist was exercising in the gym. He wiped the sweat from his face and thought that he was amazed at the increase in strength after training. Chinchu rushed towards the punching bag with a loud cry. He kicked it with his foot, sending it flying away. The system window showed that Chinchu's physique level had already reached 28. The protagonist looked at the screen and said that in terms of traditional martial arts, he would have already reached the pinnacle of the realm with such a stat. The student looked straight ahead with a slight smile. He remembered his father's face, who said that the realms of martial arts were divided into Ming, darkness, and transformation, and that the pinnacle of the Ming realm would make the boy a first-class fighter who could fight 10 people at once. The boy sat on the floor, listening to his father, who said that the dark realm would make him a fighter who could fight 100 people at once, and that this usually happened in legendary families. The man sat on a chair, saying that transformation would teach him how to fight 1,000 people. The father said that there were masters whose names were immortalized in history. He imagined a fighter with a spear. Then he thought of an old man with long gray hair. After that, he introduced a man in black clothes. The man frowned and said that the transformation realm is an indestructible body, and this is how it was described in ancient texts. The child looked at his father with a smile and asked what realm he was in. The man looked down and said that he was currently in the dark realm, but there was more to come. The boy smiled widely and shouted that his father was very cool and also belonged to those legendary families. The man looked at his son in bewilderment. A shadow fell on the man's face, and he replied that this was not true at all. Tall buildings were visible. The student entered the room and noticed that the iguana was growing by the hour. The protagonist grinned and said that evolution would occur after one more meal. While the lizard was eating, the system reported the accumulation of evolution points. A confident expression appeared on the faces of the iguana and its owner. The evolution points were full. The iguana looked at the system's notification that it was ready to evolve. Red stripes appeared on the lizard's scales. The student grabbed his shoulder and screamed loudly in pain. He fell to the floor, and spikes appeared on the iguana's back. The lizard opened its mouth wide, its whole body was shaking. Suddenly, the iguana began to jump around the room, knocking down everything in its path. Chichu lay on the floor, saying that he did not expect such severe pain. Suddenly, he looked away. The protagonist stood up, watching the iguana. He grinned, wanting to see how strong this lizard was now. Controlling the iguana's body, the boy hit the pair with his tail. The owner looked at the pet and concluded that it now had extraordinary power. The system provided information about the main character's characteristics. The iguana passed by the owner, who noticed that after evolution, its physique and attributes had increased. He looked at the windows and added that he did not feel much, and was still too weak. Chinchu grinned ominously, saying that in the future, his strength would increase and he would surpass everyone. The main character entered the room where the walls were damaged. He crossed his arms and thought that the iguana had become so big that it was now impossible to even get into the room, so it was time to return it to its true habitat. The seashore was visible. The car stopped on the beach. Chichu, who was driving, said that they were there. He got out of the car and looked at the water. The boy closed his eyes, moving into the lizard's body. The iguana entered the sea. Then the lizard dove into the depths. Chinchu closed his eyes and activated his sixth sense. He saw the silhouettes of sea creatures within a radius of 10 meters from him. There were huge, scary fish swimming in the water. The student in the body of the iguana decided that this fish with 5 eyes was an excellent target. He swam forward. The lizard accelerated, finding itself next to the fish. The next moment, there was a loud splash. Foam rose. The lizard floated to the surface, looking at another sea beast. The iguana opened its mouth and stuck out its tongue. The lizard bit the fish on the stomach. The protagonist's spirit left the lizard's body, and the system reported an increase in evolution points and constitution. Chinchu returned to the body of the iguana and swam down, thinking that the mutated fish gave as many as 10 evolution points instead of 1. The protagonist looked up and decided that with the appearance of such creatures in the ocean, the world was far from peaceful. The iguana attacked another animal. The lizard bit its prey. The system reminded Chinchu that his clone had reached the daily limit of 100 points, and that he would not be able to rise any more today. The iguana swam along the seabed, while the protagonist thought that to human eyes the ocean was cold and dark at night, but to the eyes of a sea animal the underwater world was very bright and colorful. Chinchu in the body of the iguana swam forward and thought that due to the lack of gills, he had to rely on his lungs, so he had to climb to the surface every time. The spirit of the protagonist swam next to the iguana. The lizard climbed out onto the shore of the cave. The guy grinned and decided that he would leave the iguana in this good place for shelter. The protagonist returned to the car, getting ready to go home. The car was driving along the highway. Suddenly, the student looked to the side. He frowned, mentally wondering if anyone lived here. Behind the wooden door, someone could be heard loudly calling for help. There was a van parked outside a small house. The protagonist frowned and decided it was time to put his powers to use. There were two men standing outside the door. The third man was leaning over a tied-up girl, telling her to be quiet. The bald bully kicked his subordinate for not putting the gag back in the captive's mouth. The young man grabbed his shoulder, saying that it was so dark in here that he didn't even notice. The girl looked at the bald man in fear. He grabbed her face with a smirk and ordered her to be a good girl, or he would leave her with his guys all night. The student approached the house. He closed his eyes and a red glow appeared behind him. He saw through the walls what was happening. The men were sitting at a round table. The girl was sitting on the floor, shaking with fear. The young man was looking at his phone. Chinchu touched his face and began to think about whether this was a kidnapping or human trafficking. He came to the conclusion that they needed to be dealt with as soon as possible. The protagonist ran to the door. There was a loud explosion. Chinchu rushed inside the house. He kicked one of the hooligans. He hit his back against the wall, screaming loudly in pain. A bald man swung a knife, standing behind the protagonist. Chinchu turned around abruptly and pushed the enemy away. The man threw his head back. Suddenly, someone caught him, putting a hand on the man's back. A young man in a light sweater told the boss to rest. The young man smirked and said that he was Yuan's disciple and asked to introduce himself to Chinchu. The protagonist frowned his black eyebrows and replied that he was Luo Tuan's disciple. In the countryside, there was a car parked near the house. The young man raised his hand, delivering the first blow. The boy grabbed the enemy's wrist. Then he leaned to the side. The opponent blocked his kick. Then the young man punched Chinchu in the head. The man frowned and mentally admitted that it was not bad. The protagonist bent his legs, sliding on the floor. The enemy's eyes widened sharply. The student attacked him, and he flew up. The youth fell to the floor with a loud crash. The opponent smiled and said that it was interesting. As he got up from the floor, he said that he did not expect to meet Luo Tuan's disciple when he came down the mountain. Chinchu looked straight ahead and said that it was a shame. The youth wiped the blood from his lips and asked what his opponent was talking about. He walked up to the opponent and said that he did not think that the thug would have a fist technique. The protagonist frowned and added that it was shameful for Yuan's disciple to take the winding path. The youth smiled silently. He rested his hand on his knee and said that Chinchu was arrogant. After all, he was also a disciple. The youth then jumped towards the protagonist. The enemy's two fingers were right in front of the protagonist's eyes. The student kicked the young man hard and he flew back. The enemy fell face down on the floor. The guy sat up and thought that the fight between martial arts students was dangerous. It seemed to him that the enemy's strength and spirit were superior to his. The student raised his hand and thought that he could not control himself, and that you can't do that to people, no matter how bad they were. The protagonist turned around, hearing the cry of the captive. The rope fell to the floor. The girl hugged her savior, and he said that everything was fine now. He smiled and handed her the phone and told her to call the police. The girl blushed when the guy asked her to lie to the police that she did not see his face. The captive frowned and agreed. 10 minutes later, a police patrol was already at the house. Men in uniform were carrying shields and weapons, ordering her not to move and to raise her hands. Suddenly, the policeman's eyes widened in shock. The girl covered her face from the light of bright flashlights. Guanqing entered the room, informing the chief of the information he had requested. The woman closed the door and added that they were able to find footprints on the broken door, which had been smashed with tremendous force. Guanqing threw the photos on the table and reported that 2 of the kidnappers had died immediately, while the third had fallen into a coma after suffering a concussion, and the man, according to the captive, was wearing a mask. The deputy chief picked up the photo, not understanding how such strength could exist in an ordinary person. Guanqing frowned and said that the strangeness did not end there. Purple lightning was flashing over the city. The colleagues looked out the window and realized that a storm was approaching. The car was parked on a cliff near the shore. Chinchu looked down. 3 men were walking from the water, discussing how the boss had spent the money he had just received on a woman. The pale man frowned and replied that with a woman like that, money would no longer be a hindrance to them. The thug smiled contentedly upon hearing this. The young man in dark glasses extended his arms and said that he had already arranged for the delivery of the goods and that they had rented a luxury office building to house them, as the boss had requested. The young man grinned and added that he had asked to find the most beautiful secretaries and receptionists. The boss smiled and said that he was alive thanks to his underwater breathing, and that once they found the location of the sunken ship, they would drag all the treasures to the shore. He narrowed his eyes slyly and added that then they would have all the money in the world. The 3 men turned around abruptly upon hearing a noise next to them. The boss frowned, asking who was there. Chinchu was standing by a tree in the distance, saying that he had seen many bad people, but this one was something special. The boss of the hooligans swung his knife, shouting that brave people like the protagonist do not live long. The enemy rushed towards the guy. Suddenly, a bright yellow light flashed and the enemy was thrown into the air. The protagonist knocked the knife out of the man's hands. The subordinates watched the fight, saying that their boss should have become stronger and faster after this superpower of his. Suddenly, the youth's mouths opened wide in shock. They fell to the ground, and Chinchu turned around, demanding that the enemy look him in the eye. The protagonist's eyes shone as he decided to test his power of mind control and asked the stranger's name and his purpose in being there. The man sweated in horror and froze. He then approached Chinchu and said that his name was John Changshu, and he was a smuggler who learned to breathe underwater a month ago. Changshu introduced the two men and said that he raided sunken ships in the ocean and exchanged the loot for money. The man's face turned pale, the control was dispelled. Changshu fell to the ground, screaming in pain from his broken arm. The protagonist smirked and thought that the mind control had affected Changshu's judgment as well. Chinchu looked at the man and told him to return to the ship, thinking that he could get something useful for himself. The protagonist's eyes shone brightly as he controlled the minds of all the bandits. People walked around the ship. The man with glasses asked Changshu who Chinchu was, and he introduced him as his boss. The protagonist walked around the ship with a smile. He was given the agreement to hand over the ship. He smiled and said that he would arrive tomorrow at lunch. The next day, the iguana was lying on the bottom of the ocean, which was a great place for endless food supplies. The protagonist was practicing wrestling in the gym. He frowned and thought that he couldn't rely on just the clone to get stronger, because he himself needed to train, since his control had improved after 2 battles. The iguana was sitting in a cave. There was fog in the city. Chinchu stood by a tall building, thinking that he had not gone outside all day and had gained 90 evolution points, and tomorrow he would go into the depths of the sea. The protagonist clenched his fist and thought that he was not the only one with superpowers, and he needed to get stronger, especially with such creatures in the ocean. A pumped-up man opened the hatch and said that there had been practically no catch lately. The ship was sailing through the ocean. Sharks were swimming in the depths of the water. A marine iguana approached them. The shark opened its mouth wide. The lizard swam past the predator. Then the iguana bit the shark on the nose. The evolution points were increased. The system asked if the protagonist was ready to evolve with his clone. Foam was dripping from the iguana's body. The lizard closed its eyes as red lightning flashed across its body. At the same time, Chinchu fell to the floor in the gym. The system provided information about the protagonist. Chinchu lay on his back and said that his physique was superior to that of a human, but it had not doubled even after evolution. The protagonist touched the screen with his fingers and thought that it was because his stats were low last time. On the blue screen was a caption about the ability. Affinity with water, which Chinchu did not know about. The iguana clung to the victim, its claws became sharp as steel. The lizard swam through the water at a speed of up to 70 kilometers per hour, which was faster than a ship. The protagonist sat in a chair, talking to his subordinate about sunken ships. Chinchu presented a map and thought that mainly the shallow waters of the routes used by Country Z and the main commercial routes of Countries H and R had been explored, but there were still plenty of ships in the deep water. The iguana swam in the sea, now it could breathe underwater, its sense of smell had improved. The protagonist stretched. He looked at the phone and decided that it was time. On one of the streets, a young girl was sitting near a pole. In the city, on one of the streets, people were watching a guy walking along the road. He was remembering a delicious and expensive dinner on which he spent 3,000, having only 20 in his pocket. But he reassured himself with a quick promotion to the head of Zhang's company and dreamed of wealth. Suddenly he stopped, peering at the end of the street. A blonde was sitting by a lamppost, 2 guys were hanging over her. He asked what they wanted from her. And to himself, he noted his passion for martial arts and decided not to interfere until there was a real danger. One of the guys rudely asked what Chinchu said. He asked him to leave, assuring him that he would pretend that he had not seen him. Chinchu looked at them with a look full of confidence. Behind him, one could feel the beast's power. He clenched his fists. One of the hooligans shared the feeling that a wild animal was looking at him. The other offered to leave without a fight. But the girl, feeling a surge of courage, decided to tease them. Chinchu assumed that she had gone crazy. The first bully mentally decided that it was not every day that you could meet such a lady, while the second expressed his intention not to leave things as they were. He decided to attack, shouting that the enemy was not scary. Calling him self-confident and stupid, the second supported the attack. Chinchu expected that threats would be enough and a direct confrontation was not expected, so he was slightly taken aback. Having collected his thoughts, he got into a fighting stance. Then, with one blow, he knocked out 2. The hero mentally reasoned that he used only 10% of his strength. Otherwise the blow would have turned the opponents into mush. Chinchu decided to let the bullies go this time, watching how quickly they retreated, sitting on each other, and shouting phrases that a demon had possessed him. The blonde meanwhile stood up and admired the guy's incredible strength. Chichu looked at her carefully and decided that she was on drugs. The guy called the police and described the situation, under the girl's unambiguous hints and soft protests. A few minutes later, 2 cars with cops arrived at the scene. The blonde, already in front of the police car, sadly summed up that there would be no fun today, while Chichu was giving evidence. The guy smugly concluded that there was one less thing to do. He figured that he needed to finally take control of the iguana and find the ship. The hero decided to rely on his sixth sense. It told him that the iguana was within a radius of 20 meters and made sure that the bespectacled man was right, and an image of a reptile swimming near the sunken ship had already appeared in his head. The iguana found gold bars. Chinchu turned to the captain, calling him a bespectacled man and ordering him to direct the ship 3 kilometers to the east. On the ship, a helper asked the captain if Boss John was the only one who could breathe underwater, and he was told that he shouldn't pry into other people's secrets. A reptile's tail was visible near an open box with gold bars. The lid of the box, hanging on ropes, slammed shut, and Chinchu and the iguana confirmed their find. As the box was being raised, the iguana noticed something else. The reptile and Chinchu examined the find, which looked like a special metal alloy, while the ship's crew took note of this and decided to return. The iguana grabbed a piece of metal in its paws, and Chinchu decided that it was time to examine the find. A creature several times larger than the iguana swam past. Suddenly, some monster grabbed the reptile right in the middle of the body. The unexpected attack made the find fall out of its paws, and Chinchu angrily thought about who this creature thought it was, if it decided to devour him, and although the monster was larger and longer, it was clearly inferior in strength and defense. White bones sank to the bottom of the sea. The iguana, again holding the metal alloy in its paws, carelessly set off, praising the taste of the unexpected prey. A couple of hours later, Chinchu stood by the eroded reefs and felt their hardness, making sure that the deserted night beach was the perfect place to test his strength. He hit the reef with all his might, arguing that strength works in 2 directions, and the density of his bones is several times greater than that of a human and absorbs most of the force of the blow, but the body quickly recovers and there is almost no pain. The fighter delivered blow after blow, continuing the thought that after evolution, his physique became more than 200. The guy clenched his fist harder, beads of sweat ran down his face. He continued to reason that he had not yet tested his strength in action, but here the weight is definitely not less than a ton. With his strengthening and fighting technique, he would easily punch a person through. Chinchu made a punch. Stars were visible in the sky. The guy, looking up, continued to reason that the punching bag at home is not strong enough. You can't train in the gym. If someone records him on video and posts it online, he will have no end of problems, and there will also be unnecessary public attention. Above his head, a sea wave rolled onto the sand. He thought that only in this place can he calmly train, and he added out loud that all his scratches healed in a minute, which means that he is recovering well. The guy turned his head towards the sound. At that time an iguana came out of the sea, holding a metal alloy in its mouth. The guy came closer. The oar looked at first glance quite ordinary. Chinchu tried to lift the stone but couldn't, concluding that it weighed less than 200 pounds, heavy but fragile. Even lizard claws could scratch it, so it was a good material for weapons, but due to the lack of skill, its creation is currently impossible. The guy decided to focus on the gold found today. The guys met on the yacht. The protagonist asked where everyone else was, and the man replied that they were on the ship and that they succeeded. They went into the captain's cabin. A crew member asked how much money there was, and said that he had never seen so many gold bars. Chinchu took one of them in his hand and explained that they had no markings, which meant they were minted differently, and they would not be able to sell them. People were walking around the city center. The guy came to a pawn shop and asked if they accepted gold. The employee confirmed it, and asked if he had earrings or a necklace. The young man opened a backpack full of bars and said that he wanted to sell it. Smiling broadly, the girl noticed that there was quite a lot of gold here and decided to take the client to the pawn shop owner. The heroes shook hands. The man asked if the customer had any questions and how much gold he wanted to sell. The student pointed to the backpack and said that he wanted to sell all of it. The store owner looked into the bag and asked the guest to wait a little because they needed time to check the gold for authenticity. The protagonist sat down in a chair when the check began. Returning to him, the pawnshop owner reported that the total weight of the bars was 11.25 kilograms, and asked if the customer would accept 400 yuan for each gram. The answer was affirmative. Sitting behind the wheel, Chinchu thought about how people his age were still studying at university, and he managed to earn 4.5 million yuan in one go. The guy frowned and decided to buy a new car first. He imagined how the car drove off-road and thought about how impossible it was to drive on bumpy roads. The car dealership was full of luxury cars. The store employees presented the new car to the customer. The girl bowed and greeted the other visitors. The couple entered the car dealership. Squinting, the young man noticed that this was his ex, on whom he had to spend a lot of time to please her, and remembered that she was chasing status and money, having fun with rich people. The woman smiled and told that she used to date this loser, Her new boyfriend asked what this beggar was doing in the car dealership. The man gritted his teeth in displeasure and wanted to object, but the student stopped him in time. The rich kid grinned and asked if they were really forbidden to tell the truth to his face, because he did not have money even to pay for his studies. The girl asked her lover not to waste his time on him. She approached the red convertible and said that she wanted to buy this one. The rich man agreed to buy it and said that first they needed to check everything. He frowned in displeasure and thought that he was not yet ready to buy such expensive cars, although money is needed to make a great impression on the opposite sex. The protagonist approached the SUV and decided that this is what he needed because this car has a high suspension. The couple watched him closely. The employee of the salon said that the final amount would be 2 million yuan. Chichu smiled and said that he would pay by card. His ex-girlfriend raised her eyebrows in surprise and wondered if he was really ready to buy such an expensive car. The rich guy hugged her and said that it was just a bluff because he could not have that kind of money. The girl agreed with him and remembered how her ex could not afford anything except noodles for weeks. The guys approached the SUV and asked if a poor student would really buy a premium car. The rich man grinned and asked him to stop putting on this show, because the payment most likely would simply not go through. The man frowned and said it was none of his business. The customer promised to call the guy daddy if the payment went through. The woman slyly frowned and concluded that her ex was simply lying. The store employee returned to the customer and said that the car was now his. The rich kid squinted suspiciously and wondered where he got all that money from. The girl couldn't believe that he had become so rich. The gang member grabbed the scoundrel by the t-shirt and said that now he would have to call his boss daddy. The guy waved his hand and asked his friend not to waste time on these people. The partner clenched his fist and asked the couple to appreciate the fact that his boss was so kind to them. The rich guy covered his face with his hand in disappointment. The woman rushed after the car leaving. The car dealership employees realized that she thought she had found herself a rich boyfriend, but in fact, she had missed a real chance for a better life. A view of the best restaurant in the city, Cloud's Edge, opened up. The guys went inside, and all the employees bowed to them. The heroes sat down at the table. The waitress asked what they would like to order. The student answered that he wanted to try Boston lobster and Kamchatka crab. The main character opened the menu and decided that everything here was quite expensive, but it was definitely worth it. Chuchu enjoyed the food while he was surrounded by beautiful girls. The guy closed his eyes and thought that it was time for him to enjoy the food after the pile of dishes eaten by the iguana. He took out his phone. A group chat from the university appeared on the screen. Only then the young man remembered that he was not expelled. A status window appeared in front of him, and the student realized that he did not have much time left, and that he needed to earn evolution points as quickly as possible. Deep-sea fish swam forward. The swordfish was the fastest among the rest, and could reach speeds of up to 60 miles per hour. The iguana tore the shark to shreds and decided to continue the treasure hunt after a snack. Now she had the opportunity to see everything at a distance of tens of kilometers. A large fish was swimming far ahead. The reptile stood on its hind legs and thought that it had not found a single sunken ship, although it had studied the entire seabed, and several days of fruitless searching had passed. The spiritual embodiment of the owner appeared in front of it. The protagonist asked if there were any secret supernatural organizations that were under the control of the government, and decided to be more careful. The heroes walked down the street, heading to an elite office. Chinchu looked up and realized that this was the busiest area in the city, and that it was a pretty good place for an office. The guys entered the building. The man asked the employee to call everyone to the boss's office. The office had high windows. The office workers gathered in front of the desk and greeted the new boss. The girls smiled broadly, mentally calling him young and handsome. Naishin blushed when someone introduced her to the boss. The woman brought the boss a cup of coffee. Holding the documents in his hands, the guy asked her to put the saucer on the table. The young man frowned and thought that this company had proven itself well, but its monthly maintenance cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Looking at his friend, the student suggested ending the meeting and asked everyone to return to their duties. The employees headed for the exit. The protagonist realized that he needed to develop the mind control ability, because its effect was not the most reliable. Chichu looked out the window and decided to use the clone for hunting, to become stronger without doing anything. The guy took a sip from the mug and felt just great. A cluster of bubbles rose underwater. The iguana attacked the predatory fish. The barracuda swam sharply downwards. The reptile realized that it could have suffered if not for the external force field, and concluded that the number of ferocious mutated fish in the ocean was growing. The beast grabbed the fish's head and decided that this barracuda was clearly not like the others. The young man, surrounded by a red aura, noticed that his muscles and bones had become stronger due to his clone receiving evolution points. The iguana swam forward and realized that this fish was alone. The office worker smiled and asked if their boss had a girlfriend. Sulin, who was sitting on the table, asked if her girlfriend was already trying to hit on him. The female workers turned around when someone asked if they were still not finished. The assistant replied that there was not much work left. The student adjusted his sleeves and decided to pretend that he did not hear anything, so as not to create an awkward situation. The protagonist pulled off his tie and asked if the girls wanted to go to dinner with him. They happily agreed. The heroes arrived at the restaurant. The women were thinking about how generous and rich their boss was. The waiter announced that the bill was almost 50,000 yuan. Chinchu handed her the card. The office worker smiled broadly and wondered who his parents were. Her colleagues concluded that their new boss spent money generously and that he had a bright future ahead of him. Looking at them, the guy said that he had some business to do that evening and promised to take them home after dinner. The car stopped on a deserted beach. While practicing his punch on the rocks, the young man felt that his physique had become much better than that of an ordinary person, and his punches could now easily break rocks. The student stepped back and noticed that as his strength increased, it was becoming more difficult to maintain control. He looked around and wondered if there was anyone there. There was a boat on the shore. Strangers were discussing exchanging goods for money. Hiding behind a rock, the protagonist realized that some kind of deal was taking place here and decided that he needed to be more careful, because they probably had weapons. The boy reported that the goods were in excellent condition, and then the two people shook hands, hoping for further cooperation. The man put his hands in his pockets and asked his comrade to be careful because things have been tough lately. His accomplice asked him not to worry about it because they were working on single channels. Chinchu jumped off the tree branch. The guy knocked out two strangers with one blow. At the same moment, the leader of the group took a gun out of his back pocket. The villain held it out. The young man got close to him and hit him in the jaw. The people fell to the ground unconscious. The student frowned menacingly and thought that he had done the whole world a favor by getting rid of them. The iguana swam towards the boat. The reptile hit the bottom of the boat with its head. The powerful blow tore it in half and threw the people into the air. They fell into the water and began to drown. The beast swam around them. The bandits surfaced and decided to move towards the shore when they noticed the monster. Another blow threw one of them up. Having taken out a gun, the man concluded that they would not be able to escape and decided to check if this monster would dodge a bullet. A shot rang out. The bullet bounced off the head of the iguana, who did not understand anything. The villain shuddered and asked how this was possible. The reptile opened its mouth wide. A splash was heard above the surface of the water. The beast took the suitcase in its mouth and swam to the shore. Inside the suitcase were bundles of money. Taking one of them in his hand, the protagonist realized that there were 3 million yuan in it, and thought that with cash, he could realize the scale of his earnings. The next morning, the customers of the cafe looked at Sulin, calling her amazing. The assistant put the documents on the table and asked the boss to sign them. The stranger raised his eyebrows in surprise and wondered if this was her boss. Heading to the exit, Chinchu decided to return to the office and asked the employee to notify him of the time of each meeting. The man's mouth opened in shock when he saw his strong muscles. The conference room was brightly lit. Pointing to the chart, the guy asked his subordinates to carefully consider each step of the strategy to get promoted, and explained that they would receive pleasant bonuses as long as the company's productivity increased. The young man took out his phone, and was told that today was the last day before applying to the university. The student looked at the screen and said that he had to go. Sulin brought him a jacket. The protagonist said that the employees could leave early today, and asked the assistant to handle all corporate affairs. Naishin gaped in amazement, and asked if their boss was still studying. Her colleague said that she thought he was just a rich heir. The car stopped at the university campus. Chuchu got out, and other students were surprised that he had such an expensive car. A video of him appeared on the forum, and an announcement about his return to class appeared. Haters immediately appeared in the comments. Sitting in front of the laptop, the girl thought that this man looked familiar. She remembered how they had met eyes and realized that there seemed to be a whole universe in his eyes. A message appeared on the screen saying that he was not a new student, but a second-year student of the economics department. The woman frowned and realized that they were in the same year. The guy was walking down the street, thinking that his strength was growing very quickly, but he still needed to continue training and working on his control. Squinting, the young man realized that he could kill a person with one blow, and decided that he needed to work on his strength so as not to hurt anyone. After a while, the sun was shining on the office building. The student raised his hand and said that he would like to order steel containers of 100 tons or more. The store employee asked him to go to the VIP lounge and promised to contact the sales manager. The office door slammed shut. The man shook the client's hand and asked what kind of steel he needed. The protagonist replied that he needed a 5-meter-high steel column and several steel blocks. The worker pointed to the laptop and said that the total weight of the steel would be 200 tons, and the estimated cost would be about 700,000 yuan. Chuchu smiled and agreed to sign the contract. The next morning, the heroes came to the pier. Jianshu said that this entire area was now their warehouse. The guy asked him to return to his duties. Putting his hands in his pockets, the young man realized that a new transformation was just around the corner, and thought that he still had a long way to go. The student entered the warehouse and decided to start training as soon as the steel column was installed here. Raising his eyebrows, the protagonist calculated that the maximum number of evolution points per day was 100, and realized that he had achieved nothing compared to the iguana. The police arrived at the crime scene. Guanxing reported that the gang leader was hit in the chest with great force, causing him to die on the spot, and concluded that all his accomplices were killed by one person. Guanda asked who was capable of such atrocities. The man spread his arms when someone radioed him that they had found another corpse. Chichu was sitting in a massage chair. Silen said that they didn't have any new work and asked the boss to give them an assignment. He explained that they were like fishing, they had to wait for the fish to bite. The assistant frowned tensely and wondered if the company wouldn't go bankrupt at this rate. Naixing came to the door and shouted that people had come to discuss the terms of the deal. The girl was surprised and wondered if this was the fish. The man entered the office and asked where Changshu was. The guy said that his gang was now under his leadership. Wantian grinned and introduced himself. The young man asked him to sit down so that he could discuss all the issues they were interested in. The heroes sat down at the table. Silen promised to make them some tea. The partner put his hands on the arms of the chair and told him that he had a sunken ship that was worth at least 10 million. The student asked if he wouldn't leave with all the loot as soon as they got down. Leaning back in his chair, the bandit denied this and said that he would take 70% for himself. Since this is what foreign companies do, the protagonist suggested that he contact them in this case. Chichu raised his hand and offered to split the loot 50-50. The guest frowned and thought that this was his only chance, because the law is very strict now. He got up from the chair and asked if his accomplice was sure that he could get the ship. The guy confirmed this and explained that he had his own methods. Having shaken his hand, the man agreed to split the loot in half and said that he was pleased to work with him. The young man replied that it was mutual. Standing in front of his desk, Guanda wondered who could have such huge claws, traces of which they found at the crime scene. The policeman's mouth dropped open in surprise and suggested that it was some kind of anomaly. The officer sat down at his laptop and reported the mass murder via the internal messenger. The crane installed a pillar on the seashore. Silen asked what it was for. The student looked at the pillar and explained that it stabilized the water flow and held back underwater creatures. The assistant thought that she did not know about it. Looking at his phone, the protagonist noticed that money was disappearing from his account at an alarming rate, and decided to cut back on expenses. The headlights of the car lit up. Walking to the window, the girl thanked the boss and invited him to come over to her place for a drink of water. Chinshu refused because he had business. Looking after the car leaving, the woman realized that she had said something stupid. She put her hand to her cheek and decided that this was not the best excuse to call him over. While driving, the guy remembered how he accidentally broke his chopsticks at dinner, and realized that he needed to train in controlling his own strength. The young man arrived at the seashore and began to beat stones. He looked at the abrasions on his hand and realized that he should not stop under any circumstances. Radiating red energy, the student felt everything that was happening around him within a radius of 30 meters, and thought that he could feel even a slight gust of wind or the flapping of an insect's wing. 3 days later, an iguana attacked a mutated fish with red eyes. The reptile looked up and noticed a ship above. The protagonist put the phone to his ear and asked when they would start the operation. Wantian replied that they needed to wait until the evening to prepare everything. Pulling a dumbbell, Chichu remembered how he received 15 aura points and increased strength after long training. Sitting on the edge of the side, the man reported that the sunken ship was at a depth of 700 meters and asked where his accomplices' people were. The guy replied that they were already underwater. The iguana squinted and realized that she did not feel the pressure underwater due to her characteristics. The reptile saw a deep gorge, but there was no ship there. The young man reported that there was nothing at this depth. The bandit grinned and was surprised that he checked everything so quickly. Holding the radio in his hands, the partner wondered how he managed to inspect such a large area in 20 minutes. The man with the laptop reported that the location had not changed and suggested trying to move a kilometer to the east. Wantian asked his accomplice to check everything there. The full moon was shining in the sky. The iguana approached the sea trench. Red radar circles spread from it. The reptile smiled when it found what it was looking for. Stars sparkled in the sky. The crane lifted a huge container with the loot. The company employee showed the boss a suitcase and explained that it contained 8 broken fragments and 3 artifacts worth about 30 million. The man smiled and said that he would take his share of the money. A couple of days later, the bandit brought his accomplice suitcases with money and promised to contact him later if he got any new information. Putting his hand on the stack of money, the student realized that the money problem had been solved and wanted to train until bullets and grenades no longer affected him. Litian put his hand to his chest and introduced himself. He raised his hand and offered to cooperate with the main character, who offered to discuss all the details tomorrow. Solon handed the guest a business card. The man took it and promised to see him tomorrow. Looking after him, the office employee was surprised that their new partner was so young. Naixing asked what the Tianhong company does. Her colleague answered that they earn tens of billions, and its chairman is the richest man in the city. The girl raised her eyebrows and assumed that they were relatives, because their guest had the same last name. The secretary said that this was amazing. The assistant smiled and wondered what it was like to meet such a person. Chinshu grinned and was surprised that even the son of the richest man was interested in sunken ships. The iguana grabbed the largest and most expensive fish in the sea with its teeth and claws. The waves crashed onto the shore where the warehouse stood. The fish lay in the ice. It was worth more than $10 million. Standing in front of the refrigerator, the guy asked himself why the fish was so expensive and decided that he needed to sell it to someone. The young man was working out with dumbbells when someone announced that he had a visitor. A yellow foreign car stopped at the company's office. The heroes were sitting at the table. Lityan said that he had the exact location of the shipwreck. The student asked why he was interested in sunken ships. His accomplice replied that there was no such thing as too much money. The main character squinted slyly and offered to split the loot in half. The man quickly agreed. Chinchu confidently frowned and suggested that his partner was not chasing the treasure on board at all. Raising his hand, the guy asked if his friend knew anyone from high-class seafood restaurants and explained that he needed to sell a 4-meter bluefin tuna. The deputy chairman was surprised that he had one. Taking the phone in his hand, the owner's son Tianhong replied that he had a couple of contacts and decided to invite them to dinner. After a while, the people met at the warehouse, and the potential buyer immediately ran inside. The restaurant employee approached the refrigerator and said that the fish was of excellent quality. The man smiled and offered $7 million for it. The young man agreed. Sulin looked at him and was surprised that her boss could sell only one fish for such a sum. Clouds floated above the shopping center. The assistant's mouth opened in amazement when she realized that this place sold goods of the world's leading brands. The student suggested going shopping, since now they had a lot of money. The main character took out his bank card. The girl was amazed at how easily her boss spent money. The car stopped at the warehouse. The woman looked at the boss's watch and remembered that it cost a whole $2 million. Chuchu left the bags on the sofa and said that he wanted to buy a villa for $30 million, because comfort was important to him. Sulin smiled and promised to look for something. Submarines swam deep under the water. The iguana narrowed its eyes and was upset that it was not yet strong enough to tear them apart. The reptile swam up to the gorge. Looking down, the lizard noticed something strange, but decided to leave so as not to risk it. A giant crab was walking along the bottom. The beast dodged its claw. The iguana swam back. She gritted her teeth and concluded that this crab was much stronger than those fish. The monster hit the ground with its claws with force. The reptile spread its paws and assessed its power. At the same moment, the lizard hit the crab on the shell. The beast swam up to the prey and realized that it could not eat it in one go, and that it would have to divide it into parts. The guy opened his laptop and read a report on unusual marine phenomena over the past few years. Sitting in a chair, the young man decided that something was wrong here, since giant fish and crabs appeared in the sea. Photos of destroyed submarines appeared on the screen. Crossing his legs, the student noticed that all of this had happened in the last couple of years and assumed that there was a connection between the incidents. The iguana hid in a cave to eat a crab. The reptile looked back and noticed that it had become even bigger. While beating the pole, the protagonist thought that his physical condition had improved again, and realized that now even hitting the iron with his fist did not hurt. Looking at his hand, Chinchu decided that bullets could only scratch his skin now, and concluded that from now on no one would be able to defeat him. The guy went into a bookstore. He opened a book and thought that this world was not as simple as he thought, and that reading was always useful. The girls sitting nearby were discussing his beauty and wanted to approach him to ask for his phone number. The young man imagined books with gray covers and realized that the only way to move forward was through learning. The student hit the punching bag and realized that Bejiquin and Xingyiquin seemed simple, but training in them was not such an easy task. The phone lying on the table rang. The protagonist picked it up and asked his accomplice to send him their geolocation so that his people could arrive. A little later, the iguana saw a chest of gold at the bottom. Grinning, the man asked his accomplice to find a special box and promised all the rest of the loot from the ship in return. The reptile noticed the box and realized that the gold in the chest was enough for her. The lizard frowned and wondered why they needed a pile of black mud. Inside the box was a dark liquid. The bandit grabbed his head and loudly asked what happened to his elixirs. The police cordoned off the crime scene. The officer reported that the victims were drained of blood and their muscles were dried out. Guangda suggested waiting for the chief to study everything. The deputy frowned and realized that all the victims were criminals without families. The detective crossed his arms and asked his colleague to write a report, and closed down all the entertainment venues in the city. Later that night, a stranger bit a man on the neck. The policeman gritted his teeth and asked how there could be 4 more victims if absolutely everything was closed. While beating the punching bag, Chinchu realized that he had achieved great success in martial arts. The guy looked at the system window and decided to call the new attack Explosive Fist because it combined the stance of the 8 extremes of Bejiquin and the half-step Benquin of the Xingyi technique. The boat sailed on the sea. The fisherman smiled broadly and was happy to have caught a fish after chasing a school for so long, and decided to be on the alert because he had spent a lot of money on equipment. Suddenly, a red light came on. A crew member reported that there was a hole in the center of the net, and all the fish had escaped. The captain ordered him to quickly raise the net. The iguana stuffed its mouth with fish and realized that even the sonar could not detect it. The man grabbed his head and asked what kind of monster could tear his net. The guy was sitting on a lounge chair. His friend said that he was heading back to the city, and promised to take him to a beautiful place as a token of gratitude. In front of the elegant Mengluo pavilion, there was a pond. The hostess smiled and greeted the guest. Tianrei spread his arms and hoped that no one had booked the Yunxiao Hall. The girl replied that this hall was always reserved for him. The heroes sat down at the table and were immediately surrounded by beautiful women. Leaning on his arm, the young man thought that there was always a reason for a king to neglect his duties, and realized that such places were perfect for immersing people in the atmosphere. After a pleasant evening, the car was driving through the forest. Sitting behind the wheel, the student felt that someone was following him, and he realized that he felt uncomfortable because of this aura. Grinning, the protagonist wondered if it was a monster or a ghost, and decided that he had not stretched his legs for a long time. A convertible caught up with him, and its driver suggested that they compete. Chinchu looked at him with disdain and closed the window. His car rushed forward at great speed. Looking after it, the man called its owner crazy. The boy smiled and felt that someone was still nearby, although at this speed no one could catch up with him. The boy came out onto the seashore. A stranger peeked out from behind a palm tree and asked him to give her clothes because someone had stolen all her things. The student made a sharp dash forward. He delivered a powerful blow. Suddenly, the protagonist's eyes widened in shock. A cloud of smoke rose into the air. The monster waved its hand and declared that it wanted to quickly eat its prey because of its rich life force. Chinchu asked what it was. Sticking out its tongue, Yishao called itself a more perfect version of a human and decided that her victim would taste like hundreds of healthy and energetic people. The boy jumped back, dodging her blows. The boy swung his fist and decided that this would be enough to complete the first stage of evolution. The monster asked if the enemy really wanted to eat it. The student released powerful waves of energy forward. The mermaid fell to the ground and said that this couldn't be happening. The protagonist punched a palm tree. As he destroyed the trees, the monster squirmed. Chinchu frowned and noticed that his enemy could merge with the tree roots and rocks because his aura weakened with each punch. The palm trees turned into torn stumps. The guy walked up to Yishao. The boy looked down at her and promised to give her a quick death if she answered a few of his questions. The monster smirked and asked if it looked like it was afraid of death and was upset that it would never see this beautiful moonlight again. The mermaid smirked and said that she could complete her shadow transformation if she had one more month, then even the god of war would not scare her. Before her body turned to dust, the girl was outraged that she encountered such a person in this ordinary old town. The boy turned his head and asked what it was when the system reported that the user had killed the seducer. Putting his hand to his chin, the student read that he had the ability to use attribute points to unlock new skills, and realized that the iguana would soon have special powers as well. A joyful smile appeared on his face. He imagined his pet turning into Godzilla and breathing out flames. The car stopped at a warehouse. Sitting at his laptop, the protagonist tried to find information about the seducer. A message appeared on the screen that there was no relevant information for his request. Leaning back in his chair, Chinchu assumed that someone had blocked these details, and decided that he did not have enough strength for this right now anyway. The guy grinned and wished for his strength to reach 10,000 points. A window for selecting an element to strengthen appeared in front of him, and the boy decided to strengthen lightning. An electric current ran between his fingers. The student thanked the system and suggested that this power could be increased through training. Lightning enveloped the iguana's tail. The reptile struck the toothy monster with force. The lizard bit the eel's tail and realized that it was another mutated sea creature. The beast opened its mouth, and its owner realized that even he now had lightning mastery. The people were standing at the airport of City Inn. Guangda smiled and greeted the agents from the Special Assignments Bureau, saying that he had come here to meet them. The heroes shook hands, and Jun Feng thanked the policeman for his cooperation. Nangong frowned and asked him to show them the case. There was a bloodless corpse lying on the gurney. The man pointed at it and said that the man had died the previous night, and that 4 days before, 4 people had mysteriously died on the same night. The detective put his hand to the head of the corpse and saw a ghost. Yin Xiao's spirit had vanished into thin air. The agent raised his eyebrows and explained that the aura had disappeared, meaning the killer was dead. His colleague asked what that meant. While beating the punching bag, the protagonist realized that he could not control his strength due to its rapid growth, and decided not to drop in on anyone's house to avoid causing trouble. Some time ago, the heroes were sitting in the car. Naixin invited the boss to stay for a cup of tea, but he refused. Xingqiu frowned and realized that he could not get close to her, lest he accidentally injure her. The next day, the realtor showed the client the villa and told him that the main building occupied 560 square meters and that there was a 200-meter courtyard behind it. The man raised his hand and said that the total price would be 34 million. The guy said that he would buy it for 25 million. The young man frowned tensely when his colleague asked him for help. The heroes were standing on the roof. Zhu Feng placed his hands on the railing and noticed that there had been no suspicious activity since last night, meaning that the seducer was actually dead, but it was strange because the monster was in a semi-ethereal state. The agent put his hand in his pocket and asked if they should stay and investigate. Nangong asked him to use the time to train so as not to become cannon fodder when the apocalypse came. The man raised his eyebrows and said that this could not be. Standing on the roof, the investigator explained that the next spatial vibration would be 10 times stronger than 20 years ago, and added that the most important thing now was to improve their capabilities in anticipation of that day. The detective frowned and said that this was the only way they could repay the country for taking care of them. The iguana swam to the chest with gold and was happy that it had finally found something worthwhile. The student opened an auction site and found a piece of work from the Song dynasty that was worth at least several million. The protagonist smiled and felt upset that he accidentally broke it. Chinchu saw a waitress accuse a customer of harassment. The man assumed that she dreamed it. The villain grinned and asked if he should make her dream come true. The man sitting at the table asked how he could be so shameless. The man suggested that he hit him if he didn't like something. The guy frowned and said that he had never seen such an arrogant person. The cafe visitor put his hands on his belt and urged him to resolve the issue by force. The young man came out to meet him. The student punched his palm and asked if there were surveillance cameras. The waitress took the plug out of the socket. The girl looked up and said that their cameras suddenly broke. The protagonist grinned. The villain clenched his teeth in fear. There was a sound of impact. The man fell to the floor, and foam flowed from his mouth. Chinchu waved his hand. He narrowed his eyes slyly and assumed that someone really wanted to beat him up. Dust rose in front of the warehouse. Lying on the sofa, the guy thought about how a human life does not even last a century, and this is just a moment in the life of a star. The young man looked away and decided to one day destroy the boundaries between life and death. The next day, getting out of the car, the student asked Celine to study accounting and said that one day she would manage the company's finances when the time came. The assistant scratched her head in embarrassment and agreed. Looking at the boss, the girl asked where he was going now. The protagonist replied that he wanted to sell something. Clouds floated above the city. Gao raised his hand and introduced himself to the guest. Chinchu pointed to the suitcase and wanted to know how much this plate would cost. The heroes decided to discuss it inside. In the suitcase was an ancient plate. The owner of the antique store leaned towards it and smelled the salty smell of the sea. Sitting on a chair, the man said that it was not a fake, but the fact that it was only part of a set significantly reduced its value. The guy awkwardly looked away and explained that in fact there were many similar dishes, but this was all that survived. Rising to his feet, the owner of the shop said that this was very offensive and offered 4.5 million for the plate. The young man promised to think about his offer. Taking a sip through a straw, the woman noticed that this man looked the most honest. Eating rice balls, the student confirmed this and asked if he should sell the plate in this store. Frowning, the protagonist decided that something was wrong in the merchant's look and assumed that he was hiding something. In the living room of a luxurious villa, the man asked if his subordinate had really found some kind of clue on that sunken ship. Gao opened the suitcase and asked him to look at the porcelain that had the seal they were after, saying that the man who sold him the plate must know something. Without turning around, the gang leader said that he wanted to know all the information about him. A few minutes later, the owner of the antique shop picked up the phone. Leaning on the table, the owner of the shop explained that he was an ordinary college student who unexpectedly spent 3 million to buy a luxury car, and asked if they should continue to work with him. Dong smirked and laughed. Gao handed the client the documents and asked him to fill them out because they needed details for future transactions and auctions. Lying in bed, Chichu thought about how today's deal had gone surprisingly smoothly and hoped that nothing strange would happen. The next day, standing in the elevator, the guy decided to go to college to sort out all the business, and realized that his strength, muscle density, and everything else were 50 times higher than the average person. The elevator stopped at the first floor. When the young man got out, the stranger ordered him to follow him silently. The villain put a gun to his back. A minibus was driving along the road. Sitting on the floor, the student asked where they were taking him. The driver explained that they were taking him to meet someone and asked him not to try to resist. The bandits took him to a warehouse, in the center of which there was a table. The leader angrily clenched his teeth and wanted to take a closer look at the protagonist. The protagonist scratched the back of his head and asked what they were doing here. The gang member became wary because of his calm appearance. The man jumped to his feet and ordered his subordinates to take weapons. Chinchu lunged forward and swung his elbow. The stranger was hit in the jaw and dropped his gun. The guy grabbed it in midair. The scoundrel fell to the floor. His comrades ordered the hostage to lower his weapon. Grinning, the gang leader said that his gun had only one bullet in it and announced that they had surrounded him. The young man spread his arms and said that he was the one who had surrounded them. The student narrowed his eyes slyly and promised to do everything quickly if the bandits told who was behind them. A shot rang out. The bullet hit the leader's forehead. The criminals opened fire because they realized that the enemy had no more bullets. The student threw away the gun and raised his hand. He managed to catch the bullet with his fingers. The man opened his mouth in shock and asked how this was possible. The protagonist beckoned with his finger and said that he now had enough strength for this. The sounds of blows were heard from the huge warehouse. Chinchu approached the villain and asked who sent them here. The villain replied that it was the director of Manhwa Company. The guy took out the phone from the pocket of the gang leader. The young man called Dong and suggested meeting in the evening. After looking at the screen, the bandit asked Gao to prepare everything and decided to see if their client could handle it alone. The car was driving along the road. The student ran forward and noticed that his speed reached 120 meters per second. The bodyguards surrounded the villa. The owner of the antique shop approached the boss and asked if the man was scared and did not come. The criminal said that they should not underestimate him because he managed to kill 7 armed men. The man smirked and said that he had a dozen men with pistols and another 24 subordinates, and announced that it was time to get to work. Something flashed in the air. The guards scurried around the backyard when the lights went out. The bodyguard raised his gun, ordered the backup power to be activated, and reported that the main bolt on the gate was broken. The villain slammed his hand on the table and gave the order to shoot anyone who entered the villa. The guards were dead in the corridor. 2 people pointed their guns at the door. It slowly opened. Dong opened his mouth wide and ordered them to open fire. The protagonist dealt with his henchmen and appeared before him. Director Longhua raised his hand in fear. The bandit jumped up from the table and offered him 500 million. Frowning, Chinchu said that it sounded tempting and suggested that they talk about the awakened. The criminal frowned tensely. In his memory, he saw a man surrounded by fire descend from the sky in the Tiger Mountains, and the city instantly turned into a sea of sparks. The next day, a huge lake appeared in that place, and the authorities called it the Lake of the Sunken. The guy looked down and realized that the awakened were very strong. The man shot at him, but the bullet bounced off. The boy immediately punched him and Gao in the face, and realized that everyone nearby had been killed. The police stood in front of the burning villa. Guanqing reported that 31 bodies had been found, one of which belonged to the director of Manhwa Company. Guanda frowned and guessed that the student might be involved in these deaths and the murder of people in the Red Forest. The policeman crossed his arms and realized that there had been an unexpected turn, meaning that another attack was inevitable. The detective looked down and concluded that Chinchu had strayed from the straight and narrow and did not deserve another chance. There was an empty tray on the table. Sitting on the table, the protagonist noticed that the chicken was gone, but traces of oil remained, and concluded that someone had been here yesterday. The iguana grabbed the fish with its teeth and saw that there was something at the bottom. Diving deeper, the reptile realized that it was an active volcano and felt that it was becoming increasingly difficult to overcome the pressure. The sun was shining on a warehouse on the pier. Someone was carrying a package. The guy hid around the corner and decided that he would not let him escape. The young man ran out from behind the wall and swung his fist. He delivered a powerful blow. Taking a fighting stance, the student noticed that his enemy had disappeared and wondered what kind of power this was. Suddenly, a long shadow appeared under his feet. A cloud of blue energy enveloped him. The system reported that the user's body was breaking under the action of stretching energy. The protagonist looked ahead and concluded that this was another world. There was a doorway ahead. A monster with red eyes ran out from there. Chichu swung his hand and assumed that it was a zombie. The guy killed the monster with one blow. The system confirmed the killing of a defective demon corpse. There was a sign above the doorway. The young man walked inside and realized that this was the Tiger Mountain city that Dong had told him about. Frowning, the student realized that the city had not been destroyed by humans, but had simply been transported to another world, and decided that it was too dangerous to stay here. There was a little girl standing on a tree branch. She bit off a piece of meat. The protagonist looked at his hand and wanted to use 2 points to improve his electric powers. A query about Tiger Mountain City appeared in the search bar. Looking at his phone, Chichu read that more than 30,000 people had disappeared along with the city, and thought that if they had all become monsters, there would be a lot of stat points to earn there. The guy put the phone to his ear and asked his comrade to check where the people who had been transported from Tiger Mountain City were. The next day, the young man came to the office and asked his subordinate to make him a small metal house and a durable 2-meter knife. The man explained that it might be quite difficult. The student smiled and asked if anyone would care so much about a huge knife that they would start wreaking havoc because of it. The protagonist scratched his chin and decided that he also needed armor, because demon corpses were very strange creatures. Holding a glass of wine in his hand, his partner reported that there was too much conflicting information about the survivors of Tiger Mountain City. Sitting behind the wheel, Chinchu came to the conclusion that more than 30,000 people were buried along with the city. The iguana bit into the fish and realized that it still lacked 300 evolution points to evolve for the 3rd time. Clouds floated above the villa. The guy came to meet Chinga, who owned his new house. Standing next to a box of money, the young man asked her to check it. The girl asked if it was really 20 million yuan in cash. The reptile grabbed the fish skeleton with its teeth. The system reported that the user had reached the maximum possible points. A bright fire enveloped the lizard. Red energy enveloped the student's hand. A group of ants carried food, the protagonist realized that he could hear their footsteps. A fiery aura enveloped him. Chinchu heard a patrolman complaining about his life 300 meters away, and realized that he had become much stronger. Looking at the system window, the boy learned that he could use fire breathing, and assumed that this skill appeared because the iguana ate the mutated tiger-headed fish. The huge lizard opened its mouth. The young man concluded that now his pet can be called a real Godzilla. The monster spewed flames, but this attack was still not powerful enough. The reptile noticed that someone was hiding in the depths. The monster opened the mouth of the huge fish and decided that it could break the aircraft carrier in half if it ate it. The iguana tore the fish to shreds. Taking a piece of meat in its teeth, the lizard decided that this tiger-headed fish would give it more than 2,000 evolution points, and wanted to hide in the cave. Suddenly, the monster opened its mouth in surprise. There was a giant skeleton in front of it, which caused the reptile to be very afraid. The monster frowned. The system reported that the user had found an ancient factor that could be absorbed. The iguana was enveloped in a red aura. It had managed to obtain the power of the ancient animal's scarlet flame. A fire ignited in the lizard's mouth. A powerful explosion was heard on the island. Looking at the cloud of smoke, the monster realized that it had terrifying power. At this time, the student picked up a huge sword and decided that his new titanium armor was quite comfortable. The protagonist smiled and noted that he had learned to detect other creatures after the last evolution. There was a little girl standing behind the door. Chenchu assumed that she was one of the survivors of Tiger Mountain City. The guy entered another world and saw that there were many more monsters at night. He cut the corpse of a demon with a heavenly sword. The young man swung the blade and spent 3 points on durability and 2 on the sharpness of the sword. A huge demon with glowing eyes dodged his attack. The student looked back and thought that it was quite fast. The swordsman put the weapon on his shoulder. The protagonist squinted and spent another 5 points on enhancing the reflection of armor blows. Suddenly, he frowned sternly. There were 2 more monsters behind him. Chinchu dashed forward. With one blow, he managed to kill several corpses of second-level demons. The guy stopped and looked back. The giant mutant swung his fist. The boy put his hand in front of him to block his blow. The student knelt down and realized that his enemy was just as strong, but too slow. The swordsman cut his body with his blade and gained 100 attribute points. Frowning, he thought that the monster's level 5 explained why it had to be hit more than 5 times to kill it. The protagonist looked at the house. Someone asked him to leave. The girl hid behind the wall. Chinchu decided that she had no evil intent. Stroking her head, the guy promised to take care of her and offered to go to the city and buy her new beautiful clothes. The sun was shining on the houses. Sitting behind the wheel, the boy asked what kind of dark river was in this flooded region. The child replied that it was a black tide and that it was very dangerous. Cece put on a white dress. She happily ran to the table when the student offered her a snack. While chewing on a chicken leg, the protagonist thought about how his armor had suppressed his scarlet flames during the battle, and wanted to invest the remaining stat points into his armor. He clenched his burning fist and realized that he had surpassed the intermediate level and had become at least 3 times stronger. The boys were sitting in the university lounge. The boy raised his hand and said that the place where they were training looked like at least a lieutenant's place. The girl asked if they had really attracted the attention of the secret department. Entering the room, the man said that after the training was over, the most successful participants would become lieutenants, and asked if the children wanted to continue training. The heroes happily agreed. Chinchu punched a tree. A large dent appeared on it. The boy realized that his body was forcing the power of the scarlet flames to gather inside him and burst out, and decided to call this movement Annihilating Flame. Sitting on the ground, the young man assumed that 100 blows should be more than enough, and realized that he could kill the corpse of the demons in 3 blows. There were cars parked at the university campus. The girl looked at the main character and called him handsome. Her friend assumed that he was just another rich kid. The guys were sitting in the car. The boy asked if this man really worried his girlfriend so much. The man explained that this student saved Linrua from 4 kidnappers. The guy folded his hands behind his head and asked how he did it. The student decided that it must have been difficult. The young man was sitting on a bench with his new companion. The iguana saw a shadow ahead. A yacht filled with bandits from the country of Kangaroo was floating on the surface of the water. The lizard realized that this was the perfect place to test his strength. The crew members ran around the captain's cabin in panic because they noticed a large and quickly approaching life form. The reptile scratched the boat. Water penetrated the deck. Someone shouted that 2 cabins at the stern of the ship were damaged. The man opened his mouth wide and ordered to close the valves to stop the water flow and to turn on the multi-beam bathymetry. The sailor ran to the screen and reported that the creature was 40 meters long. The captain asked what kind of monster it was and ordered to open fire and turn on the turbines at maximum power. The iguana noticed the approaching torpedoes. The lizard swam away and thought that the shells would not be able to hit it. A submarine was floating at depth. The reptile hid behind it. There was a powerful explosion. The monster opened its eyes in surprise and realized that the explosions could damage it. A girl was dancing on the stage of the theater. The boy smiled and said that she was one of the 4 most beautiful new students. The main character raised his eyebrows in surprise and recognized her. Cece called her very beautiful. The woman bowed. Someone came out on stage behind her. Handing the artist a bouquet of flowers, the student said that he fell in love with her at first sight and asked her out. Qian looked at the audience and explained that her audience would not allow her to agree, and she did not like this kind of guy at all. The girl walked up to Qinchu and asked if he remembered her. The dancer put her hands on her chest and told him about how he called the police last month and saved her, and the young man remembered it and asked what happened. The woman blushed, not knowing what to say. The student scratched his head and said that he had to go. The artist put her hand on her chin and realized that his car was worth at least 2 million yuan, and that, unlike Wei Jian, this man lived in prosperity. The protagonist climbed the mountain. He smirked and realized that he needed to find a cave before the black tide came. Qinchu chopped several third-level demon corpses into pieces. Frowning, the boy noticed that one of them had developed the energy to create flames and asked if he could increase the armor resistance of the demon gifts. The system confirmed it. The boy crouched in front of the burning monster and realized that his armor made him invulnerable to normal flames. The iguana looked at the island and thought that she should hunt fish farms now, because mutated fish are very hard to find. The lizard saw a school of fish and decided that this should be enough. The student defended himself with his sword. The monster pounced on him. The swordsman narrowed his eyes and noticed that he had a blade-like appendage on his arm. Taking a fighting stance, the protagonist understood his strategy and declared that it was time to end this. Qinchu made a sharp dash forward. An old man's face appeared on the demon's chest. A wave of fire burst out of his mouth. The boy raised his sword in front of him and used annihilating fire. The man's eyes widened in shock. The boy cut the monster's body with his blade. The student looked at the system window and decided to study the core element of thermonuclear fusion. A demonic heart appeared on his sword. The system reported that the weapon had been upgraded to an unusual level. The swordsman cut the air in front of him, and a wave of fire burst forth. The protagonist smiled widely and realized that he could combine the power of fire and lightning to create energy shots. On the other side of the city, a spider-like corpse of a demon appeared. Frowning, Qinchu concluded that this forest looked too ominous, and decided that he should go back first. The boy took off his clothes and walked out of the portal. Cece closed the door behind him. Looking back, the boy was surprised that his companion could close the formless door, and assumed that she had power over space. The student frowned when a message appeared about the possibility of upgrading the warehouse space, and confirmed the upgrade. Holding the sword, the protagonist said that this was exactly what he needed and thought that carrying this weapon around would be inconvenient. The iguana ate the fish. In just 3 hours its body grew 5 or 6 meters, and it also managed to get more than 500 evolution points. The sailor shone a lantern on the sea and asked what happened to the tuna. His friend replied that it was quite strange. Blood appeared on the surface of the water, which scared the crew very much. The lizard hit the ship with its tail, turning it into a pile of metal. Standing on the street, Qinchu noticed that he had more than 100 attribute points left, and spent them on increasing his sense of chi and punch strength. The guy jumped high into the air and thought about how he now had the ability to linger in the air and sense the slightest movement within a radius of 500 meters. The news was on TV. The presenter reported that a strange black fog had appeared in the city, which had already caused the disappearance of more than 50 people. Frowning, the young man realized that it was like a black tide in Tiger Mountain City, and concluded that there would be no peace in the world. Deep underwater, a submarine was floating. The mutant approached his colleague and asked how the research was progressing. Banjun grinned and reported that they had obtained a special substance from the bodies of giant animals and even discovered a method by which animals regenerate. The lion squinted and assumed that this meant that they would now be able to create unusual people. The scientist added that they would have the ability to control even the largest animals. The people came out onto dry land. The man said that they had brought a miniature nuclear power plant. A huge sword pierced the body of the sea dragon. Its body was in a capsule. The intruders connected to it to transfer the energy of the core. Kant looked up and said that the animal knew that the metal collar would kill it, and must follow their instructions. The research assistant standing behind him compared his boss to Einstein. The monster was floating in the liquid unconscious. The mad scientist smiled and said that the beast would soon wake up. The iguana climbed into the cave and decided that the people who were trying to reanimate the giant animal should die. The lizard hit the ground with its paw with force. The people noticed it and realized that it had to be stopped. Binjun's brows furrowed in fear. The professor ordered his colleague to board the submarine. The soldiers opened fire. Multiple explosions were heard on the reptile's body. The research assistant looked at it in horror. The monster narrowed its eyes menacingly. The monster leaned over the cloud of smoke. The military man opened his mouth wide and shouted that even armor-piercing shells and exploding bullets could not take it. The iguana hit them with its tail and concluded that this was all that people were capable of. The lizard belched fire. Flames fell on the intruders. The scientists managed to hide in the submarine. The reptile looked back and noticed that they were trying to escape. Suddenly, an explosion was heard in the cave. The animal in the capsule trembled. The iguana looked at it and realized that it had actually been reanimated. The lizard opened its mouth and belched fire. An explosion tore the body of a monster that had just woken up. The system reported that the user had found a damaged ancient mind. The reptile saw a mountain of meat in front of it and decided to absorb everything. The guys were sitting at a table in a cafe. The main character was surprised that he now had the opportunity to become stronger during rest after absorbing a damaged mind. The phone lying on the table vibrated. A message appeared on the screen. Situ invited her friend to have lunch together. Chinchu took the phone and promised to pick her up at 11 o'clock. Fighting monsters, the guy thought that 3 swords could cut even a tank. The young man destroyed a flying monster of the 4th level. He ran forward and noticed someone's presence. A huge worm crawled out to meet him. The student frowned and realized that the enemy was able to damage his extraordinary defense. The worm soared into the air after another blow. The blade of the sword hit the force field. The swordsman squinted tensely. He cut off the monster's head and received 200 attribute points. The protagonist lowered his weapon and noticed that the temperature of his flame had increased to 10,000 degrees. Looking at the winged monster, Chinchu thought that his attack range had also increased to 30 meters. Sitting on the couch, the guy said that the external aura increased his power, and the sense of chi, weapons and armor helped him repel demons. The young man lit his hand and decided that he needed to practice a destructive blow, a heavenly jump and lightning control. The next day, the heroes met on the street. Situ asked what they would eat and promised to pay for her friend. The student suggested eating seafood. The guys sat down at the table. The protagonist wanted to order 2 wild flower dragons and 2 oysters. The girl looked down in fear and realized that she could not afford such an expensive lunch, because it was more than her rent for 3 months. The woman raised her hand and asked her friend to lend her some money. Chinchu replied that he had already closed the account and asked her to enjoy the food. Putting her hands on her cheeks, Situ congratulated him on opening a seafood company and suggested that this was the reason he rarely went to college. The guy smiled and explained that he did not go to school because he was killing monsters and leveling up. The girl thought that they were talking about some kind of game. The waiter put a huge crab on the table. The young man looked away and thought about how he would no longer be able to enjoy such a luxurious meal if the apocalypse suddenly happened. They went to an expensive store and Situ thought about it. The protagonist told her that after the meal he wanted to go shopping, but she did not expect him to go to LV. 80,000 for food, and after that another 20 to 30 was thrown away on clothes. She could not even buy his button with her 2 months of allowance. Chinchu took the girl by the hand and offered to go buy her some clothes, and she mentally noted that he grabbed her hand, obviously thinking that it was that easy with her. The cashier looked at the purchases in shock when the young man said that he was taking everything and paying with a card. Looking at the client with confusion, the girl recognized him and remembered that the girl he came with before was very pretty, but he found someone even prettier in less than a month. Embarrassedly looking at the purchases, the student figured that her companion had bought her clothes for $30,000, and this was only their first meeting. Perhaps this is what they call throwing money down the drain. Glancing at the guy's back, Situ mentally wondered that he was not going to take her to the hotel, and did not understand what to do. At the same time, in the hall nearby, athletes ran away screaming from the monster. And this is exactly what the hero was recording now. Turning to his companion, the boy said that he had urgent business to attend to and would now send her back to school, to which she decided that he had no intentions. Looking anxiously at her classmate, she suggested that perhaps he wanted them to get closer slowly, and that she must be making it up. The young man was more interested in the fact that a space rupture had occurred nearby and that something was wrong. A little later, the boy looked into the dark hall. Looking closely into the darkness, Chinchu realized that this was the real world, but the poisonous aura still appeared. When he managed to catch up with the monster in the alley, it realized that it had been seen. The enemy rushed to attack, shouting about his intentions to kill. But the fighter destroyed it with one kick, receiving a notification about the death of the poison monster. Landing on his feet, he realized that the enemy was not demonic, like that dark elf. The remains of the monster lay on the asphalt, outlined in chalk. The deputy police chief folded his arms and said that he wanted to use this poison monster to see if his interlocutor's hard work had paid off, but it turned out that someone had killed it before him, and Guanqing remarked that she thought it was a very strong creature that controlled fire. The policeman frowned and asked when someone who could control fire had appeared in the city. At this time, the protagonist was watching the news, where the announcer reported that a large number of space ruptures had appeared in the world today. Unfortunately, it seemed like the apocalypse had begun. Frowning, Chichu muttered that the apocalypse of 99 was probably coming. Over the past 20 years, more than 500 cities had perished on the battlefield. Picking up the phone, the young man continued that they had paid with their blood for 20 years of peace. They had entered an era that belonged to ordinary people, and anyone could become special. Looking at the screen, the hero sent this to his grandfather, but it was still not enough. he had to report to the city's special department if he wanted to get more information. The lizard encountered a demonic whale. Observing the enemy, the converted one concluded that it could make heavy water from seawater. Rushing into battle, the boy decided that it was useless. The hero pierced the monster's face with a fire beam. Grinning, the young man estimated that once he ate this giant whale, he would receive at least 10,000 evolution points. In the rest area of the city's special department, there was a conversation about whoever killed that poison monster yesterday. He was good, better than any of them. But another objected that control over fire does not mean anything, it must have been an ordinary awakened citizen. Taking the mug in her hands, Guanqing guessed that it was him. Even now she did not think that she could do what he did that day. The deputy chief looked into the room and, having informed that someone had registered an evolving human during the day, offered the boys to take a look, and they agreed. Soon they were watching Chichu, who was ready to take the test. One of the team pointed her finger, and remembered that this was the guy who had driven up to the school in a luxury car. The officer blushed, recognizing him. The deputy frowned, also recognizing him. Putting his palm on the instrument, the man said that registering the evolution meant that the candidate would undergo a small test that would determine his strength and speed, and when he agreed, he added that they were using an instrument that could display up to 15,000 kilograms of force, asked him to hit the command with all his might. One of the agents asked Old Man Lee how strong he thought this guy was, how many stars, and he suggested that he had killed a poison monster last night, so he was definitely stronger than them. He suggested 3 stars. Turning to them, the girl suggested 4, and the first questioner suggested that if that was true, then he had about 5,000 strength in one blow, and she noted that he was quite confident that he could handle the test. The third objected that this was nonsense. Their captain had evolved to 5 stars and he only had 10,000. The hero looked at the screen with displeasure. The device showed 12,000, and while he himself was thinking that he had hit too hard, the observers began to say that the candidate really did have 5 stars and even more. Guanda folded his arms and said that the guy had reached the 5-star standard and could earn 50,000 yuan every month in the city's special department. If he wanted to join them, he would earn much more. They would promote him to vice chief and he would get a title. It sounded good, but he replied that he always played alone. The policeman frowned and asked if he had killed the poison monster yesterday, and the hero confirmed it. The man put his hands on his hips and asked if he also had the ability to use fire, because it was a great power, just like the awakened ones he had seen recently. With his talent, the god of fighting Jiang could take him as a disciple if he joined the department. The young man frowned and remembered who they were talking about, and doubted that people saw this as the ceiling of their abilities. Extending his hand to the other man, the hero thought that his huge lizard should have remained a secret, and he had other ways to become stronger, so he rejected the offer out loud, although he called it pleasant. Lydian, after reading the information, called his friend and asked if he had really evolved to 5 stars and got to the first place, asked him to take care of him. Sitting on the couch at home, he promised to do so with a laugh. Putting the phone on the table, the protagonist remembered that even classmates he had not seen for years called to congratulate him. There were too many calls. It became clear what it was like to be a god among people, and after eating a giant whale, his lizard became 90 meters long. Stretching, the young man guessed that with his coating, he could even withstand an armor-piercing shell. If compared to other evolved ones, he was at least at level 7 or 8. Dropping his hands, the protagonist guessed that 7 stars was the maximum level that an awakened could reach at all, and there was still a noticeable gap between these 10th level battle gods. Raising his hand and activating his power, the boy assumed that in a peaceful world, even if his power grew every day, if he did not have a worthy opponent, there would be an unchanging feeling of emptiness. Clenching his fist, the fighter realized that now everything was different. The apocalypse had come, and terrifying monsters had stepped through space and time, ending up in their world. Looking ahead with a grin, the young man added that now countless strongest awakened, evolved and war gods would be on the same field. Getting up from the couch, the guy figured that the stakes were rising, and he could finally refuse to stand shoulder to shoulder with these gods. Determination appeared in his gaze. The hero decided that he would suppress them and become an even stronger being. At this time, the phone rang. He watched with a smile as the work chat was bursting with praise in his direction, and replied that it was nothing, someday they would achieve the same. He smiled softly and let out a chuckle when a squabble began among the employees, and wrote not to relax at work. Everyone replied that they were ready to work. The action moved to the warehouse in the docks. While Cece looked at the protagonist with anxiety, he summoned his sword. With a confident smile, he told the little girl that they were back. The girl created a door and reported this. She opened the door, pronouncing her actions. Glancing at his partner, the young man asked her to wait there and not move while he took a look. The warrior took a step inside. Covering his nose, the boy noticed a strange smell. Something was wrong, and it also turned out that the door led them to a new place every time they opened it. Glancing back, he thought that if they wanted to check the world on the other side, his partner should have held the door open. Frowning, he added out loud that even if that was the case, one of its more terrible monsters could have found out about the door's existence. Scratching his cheek, the hero remembered the red-eyed one who was chasing him, could have found out about the location of the door by the place from which he disappeared, and could have sent the sausage monster after him. As soon as the door closed, a new location was formed behind it, and he needed to study it again. Touching his nose with his finger, the young man assumed that this was a world created by a completely random monster. Putting his hand on his hip, he added that this was also not bad. As the hero moved forward, he received a notification that the excessively high temperature killed most living beings in seconds. Creating a barrier, the boy realized that his scarlet flame was capable of creating combustion at high temperatures. Covering his face with his hand, the warrior expressed regret, because a warm breeze would even relax him. The young man shuddered when the system reported that his body was affected by poisonous substances, but it blocked the effect with temperature, and this invulnerability would last for 15 hours. Looking around, the hero figured that no matter how strong his body was, it seemed that it could not fully withstand the effect of this poison. He even imagined how those awakened gods of war would remain untouched, because they were simply insanely strong. Heading forward, the guy decided that it did not matter, he could not waste time and see what was in this world. He closed his eyes, activating his senses. Waves of perception spread throughout the area. Opening his eyes, the warrior muttered that he did not find a single sign of life or a monster, completely empty. Chunchu climbed higher, continuing to reason that it was not surprising that life could not have arisen in such a hell. It was worth asking Cici to open another door. A sound from behind made the hero turn around sharply. The young man struck the lava monster that had crept up from behind. But the enemy flew to the side, gathering itself back together, and the system reported that it was a third-level poison smoke monster. Grinning, the warrior thought that he did not even notice it. There was something in this world after all. The enemy rushed at the guy with his fists. But he crashed into the heat barrier, which puzzled him. While the monster was accelerating again, the hero realized that it was not about his feelings. The creature was completely not alive. Gathering energy in his palm, the young man declared that since it was a disgusting monster, he had to use thunder that repels evil spirits to destroy it, destroy evil. Lightning crackled in the protagonist's hands as his opponent accelerated for another attack. The electric arrow was prepared, and he threw it at the enemy. The arrow pierced the smoke spirit, burning it. Watching the skull fall down, the young man received a notification that he killed a level 3 monster and received 20 attribute points. The warrior frowned and repeated the monster's level. Clenching his fists, the guy muttered that it seemed powerful and it was impossible to take it with physical attacks, and now he could do nothing with it. Besides, the monster was made of lava, which meant that fire attacks were also useless. Lightning ran through Chunchu's fingers as he added that he was just lucky that he had the talent of electricity. If not for it, the battle would have been much more difficult. At that moment, footsteps were heard, and the young man turned around. Seeing his partner, the warrior immediately moved towards her, and reminded her that he asked her to wait outside the door. It was dangerous here. The girl pressed her palm to her chest and admitted that she was worried. Smiling softly, the guy thought that there could be danger behind the door too. Stroking Cici on the head, he asked her to keep away from him, and under no circumstances to come closer. His partner nodded and disappeared into thin air. A new sound attracted the hero's attention. Turning around, he activated his radar again. The young man headed towards the sound. He moved at great speed. The hero jumped from stone to stone. From the very top, he made a dash further. Soon he landed on another rock. He saw a megalithic structure. Looking at it carefully, the guy figured that it could be called a structure, but it looked more like a limited space or a prison. The aura of a huge monster could be hidden inside. Approaching the dragon in the center of the stones, he concluded that it turned out that the real treasure hidden in this world was him. The monster looked at the intruder with displeasure when he called him a real dragon. Looking at the dragon with curiosity, the warrior added that he did not even want to think about his stats. At this time, Vandenfeld rose up, tugging at the chains, and said that stupid people called him without thinking about their lives. He found it funny. Spreading his wings, the monster said that this was his world, and since the intruder was in front of him, he would be merciful and give him 2 options. Looking sullenly at the intruder, the dragon continued that the first option was a funeral, although there would not even be ashes left for it. Raising his muzzle, the monster added that the second option was that he would gladly accept a new servant, as long as he recognized his strength, Vandenfeld's strength. The protagonist grinned. Nothing could be done. Spreading his arms, he said that he needed his bones. The dragon became furious and screamed, "How dare a man!" He hung over the intruder, and new smoky spirits crawled out of the lava. The young man smiled, squinting his eyes and admitting that it was stupid of him to think that the poison monsters were impressive. The warrior grinned and asked the dragon what it meant, that those who had agreed to become his servants had turned into these monsters. But the monster turned away and ordered the others to kill the intruder and throw his corpse into the lava river. Enemies were approaching from all sides. But the man only grinned. And he darted forward like lightning. With a crack, he rushed past each smoke spirit. All the enemies were destroyed by flashes of electricity. The dragon gritted his teeth, not understanding how it happened that his servants had disappeared, to which the boy said that now he thought the black dragon could become an interesting pet. Turning to the monster, the warrior offered him the opposite, to become his servant. The black dragon opened his mouth wide and furiously insulted the protagonist. The ground around the boy was covered with cracks with a loud sound. He grabbed the sparkling sword by the hilt. Vandenfeld rose above the warrior. The boy grinned, looking at the wild beast. Then he swung his sword sharply. The dragon screamed in pain, the chains tightening around its neck. Golden blood appeared on the dark skin of the monster. Vandenfeld breathed fire, shouting that he would send Qinsha to hell. The beast clenched its sharp teeth as the warrior laughed. The monster attacked the enemy with hellish flames. The boy held the sword in front of him, using the technique of the body of scarlet fire. A transparent round dome protected the protagonist from this attack. He grinned and mockingly asked if the dragon was capable of anything more. The monster inhaled a deep breath of fiery streams. His eyes shone blindingly, and he screamed that the boy was about to burn to ashes. A powerful stream of flames came out of Vandenfeld's mouth. Thick smoke rose around, and the beast said that no one in this world could withstand even a second of his hellish flames. Through the smoke, Qinshu's silhouette was barely visible, and he replied that he had briefly entertained the idea that his enemy was strong. He placed his hand on his head and concluded that the beast was simply an overgrown monster. The monster opened its mouth wide in shock. The protagonist jumped up, pushing off the ground. He hit his opponent in the face with a loud sound. The next second, there was a deafening explosion. The guy jumped down, grinning, saying that he had extraordinary control over the flames and the strength of the monster emperor's arm, which was the best defense against the flames. He looked straight ahead and concluded that he could simply ignore the dragon's heat. The monster lying on the ground concluded that his enemy was immune to his fire. Vandenfeld placed his paw on the ground, glaring at the warrior. He opened his mouth wide in front of the boy, screaming that he would hardly be able to withstand a blow from his sharp teeth. The monster clenched his fangs tightly. The warrior jumped high into the air, avoiding the attack. Then he fell on the enemy's back and plunged his sword into his body. A satisfied smile appeared on the protagonist's face. The boy ran the blade along the dragon's spine. Scarlet blood gushed from the fresh wound. The sword stopped when it collided with bone. The youth frowned in confusion. Then he jumped on the dragon's wing and struck again. The warrior jumped to the ground, noting that the dragon was not called Fire Wings for nothing, because it could change its color to red. The monster's body began to emit a bright glow as it surrounded Qinshu, but he said that resistance was useless. The boy said with a confident smile that he had learned one small move from his enemy called Bloodburst. Vandenfeld rushed forward, outraged that the protagonist dared to steal his moves. The youth jumped above the enemy and swung his brightly burning sword. In one move, he cut the beast's body. The dragon's head flew into the air. The warrior stood next to a defeated level 5 enemy, for which he received 1,000 attribute points. The boy's eyes turned white, and he said that the game was over. A ghost of a little girl appeared near the monster's body. Cici sat down next to the beast and concluded that it was dead. Qinshu stretched out his arms and said that the enemy was frighteningly strong, but in the end, only 10% of the chi energy was spent, and natural recovery covered it. The protagonist looked at his palm and decided that he would call this form a Type 1 blood burst. The warrior stood by the defeated Vandenfeld and thought that its size, teeth, flesh, and even its lava-like blood were unusual materials. The monster's eyes were still open, and the boy decided that its head alone would be worth at least 100 million. The youth thoughtfully touched his chin and thought that he would somehow have to explain where he got the head of a level 5 dragon from, and do it in a way that would not reveal his too high strength. He picked up Cici and thought that he would keep the enemy's body. After all, it could even be delicious. Blue lightning appeared around the beast's head as the protagonist exchanged 200 attribute points to buy a storage. The boy bent his hand and decided that he would spend 400 attributes to strengthen his intuition, thanks to which the aura of monsters could no longer be hidden from him, as well as inanimate objects. Qinshu closed his eyes and spent another 400 attribute points to increase the intimidation of his armor. The warrior smiled. A red glow appeared around him, and he guessed that he had awakened the royal intimidation. Red fire rose from the boy's hands. He thought that this intimidation could make a person tremble in fear. With a confident expression, Qinshu concluded that even the slightest glance could make a person helpless. The warrior closed his eyes and sighed heavily. The dragon's body next to him disappeared, and he decided that it could be useful for cleaning fish. Country P's fishing boat was sailing on the sea. Two young men were happily shouting that the fish were biting. There was a small catch lying on the floor. The short-haired sailor crossed his arms and said that the main thing was that the fish were alive, and it did not matter that there were few of them. The other man raised his finger and looked away in shock. A large wave was rising in the sea. The young man looked at the sparkling lightning in the distance. Suddenly, with a loud explosion, many fish flew out of the water. They began to fall on the ship, and the sailor shouted with joy. The monster clenched its sharp teeth tightly. The iguana swam deep into the sea. Chinchu looked down and thought that the king's intimidation made the iguana's suppression even stronger, and therefore nothing could move in its surroundings. Blue lightning cracked. The warrior rose into the air, saying that he could fly when he used fire and electricity at the same time. Lightning stretched from his feet to the ground, and Chinchu thought that people have always strived for the sky. He flew higher and thought that as long as he combined the power of fire and electricity, he could be free of gravity. The warrior accelerated as he flew upward. Suddenly, a puzzled look appeared on his face. The protagonist flew forward, thinking about what his intuition was telling him about the unexplored places of this world located here. He frowned and thought of a creature that even the dragon that ruled this world did not know about. The boy left a blue beam of light behind him, thinking that there must be something more powerful than a magical dragon. He was climbing the stairs in the ruins of the giant kingdom. There were dragons painted on the cracked walls. Somewhere, chunks fell off the wall. The warrior looked at the paintings and came to the conclusion that there was a civilization of giant dragons here. He frowned, not understanding if they worshipped a real dragon god. The boy looked at the huge door and felt great danger from there. He quickly ran along the road. Chinchu looked at the stone dragon statue and decided that Flame Wings was their younger brother. System notifications appeared in front of the boy, saying that he was immune to poisoning due to his great strength. However, in 3 hours, his strength would weaken and he would be exposed to poisoning. The warrior frowned and said that he was right because there was something strange happening in this temple that had not revealed its essence, but could already cause poisoning. He shouted loudly with a furious expression for the unknown person to stop hiding. A powerful stream of air rushed in front of the protagonist. Surprise appeared on his face. A golden beam of light struck the ground. The unknown creature had white skin and a red circle was visible on its face. It was difficult to determine its emotions from the creature's face. The warrior silently looked at the monster with 2 pairs of arms floating in the air. The creature raised one hand. Spreading its fingers wide, it cast an eternity spell. The protagonist frowned and gritted his teeth. He pulled out the sword from the ground. Then he created a protective barrier, and the red beams did not touch him. While holding the shield, the youth tried to understand if this exalted could be a 6th level. He stared ahead and came to the conclusion that this monster must be a 7th level demon. The unknown continued to attack the protagonist. Without lowering his hand, he ordered the warrior to bow and surrender. The young man swung his sword, and the ground beneath him cracked loudly. He clenched his teeth tightly and asked if the enemy wanted to die. Then he raised his head up and screamed loudly, while a fiery aura formed around him. Rock fragments flew into the air. A powerful explosion was visible in the distance. The warrior smiled slightly. His body radiated orange energy, and he said that his opponent was about to die. The demon hung silently in the air, removing one pair of hands behind his back. His eye narrowed, and he used the technique of the first form of blood explosion. Many small fragments rushed towards the guy. He began to swing his sword, cutting them into pieces. The warrior reflected these attacks with incredible speed. The sword spun in his hand. Then, along with a white flash, a loud sound was heard. Chinchu cut the enemy's body into 2 halves. He fell to the ground, leaning down with his hand. The monster put 2 fingers to the back of his head. The protagonist froze as the enemy called him a disgusting ant. Suddenly, thick smoke appeared in the air. A white creature stood in the middle of the fog. Suddenly, it turned around abruptly. The warrior frowned and shouted that he intended to end this. The enemy jumped up. Dark red energy began to appear in his hands. Their collision caused yellow sparks to appear in the air. The warrior's eyes shone brightly and he smiled contentedly. He cut the opponent's body with his sword again. It turned out to be a clone, and the real monster was untouched. Suddenly, a blade of a weapon appeared in his chest. Chinchu stood behind the demon with a sly grin, using the second form of blood explosion technique. The enemy grabbed the warrior's hand. Extending his other pair of hands, he shouted that the guy was arrogant. A powerful explosion was heard. The sword pierced the ground. Behind the thick smoke, the silhouette of the protagonist was visible, who said that his weapon would only slow down his attacks, so he would deal with the enemy with his own hands. With a wide smile, he jumped up. The monster stretched out all his arms in different directions. The youth hit him so hard that he flew back. A loud explosion was heard under Chinchu. The demon fell head first onto the stone's surface. Then he flew up. White cracks appeared on his black face. Yellow lightning appeared in the air. The warrior appeared in front of the enemy, looking at him with a sly grin. He placed his palm on the demon's face. Chinchu pressed the enemy into the ground with such force that it was covered with deep cracks. Gray smoke rose. The youth looked at the white creature with hatred. The demon looked at the warrior from above. He made a rectangle with his fingers using the trap technique. The guy turned around abruptly. He sat on his knees. A chain of explosions passed around him. Chains wrapped around the protagonist's leg. They twisted around his limbs. Chinchu clenched his hands into fists and frowned. He stood in the middle of a stone surface. The system reported that the formation sealing the dragon can collect the energy of the sealed object and use it to strengthen itself. The warrior looked at the enemy and realized that this is how he trapped the ancient dragons, because if he resisted, it would be even more difficult to get out. He tensed his hand and said that the demon was not good enough to seal him. Chinchu bent his knees. He smiled and added that it was because he was not like those stupid dragons. The chains broke. They fell down. The guy grinned maliciously and proudly shouted his name. The monster widened its red eye in shock. It silently froze in the air, looking down. The protagonist's legs emitted yellow energy. He looked up. Then he took a step forward. The monster assumed a tense posture as the warrior disappeared. Chinchu was next to the enemy. He clenched his hand into a fist, furiously frowning his black eyebrows. Cracks appeared on the demon's frightened face again. The monster flew back from the youth's strong blow. He swung his fist again. Then he hit the enemy. There was a confident grin on the warrior's face. The demon's body disintegrated into many pieces. White flashes appeared in the air. Holes appeared on his skin. The boy flew up to the enemy. He pressed him into the ground with a blow. Gray fog rose into the air. Chinchu looked down silently. A beating demon lay on the ground. The warrior shouted with a smile that he needed the enemy's power. The white creature disappeared. The system reported an improvement in skills. The protagonist sweated tensely when he learned that he had overexerted himself, and the poisoning by a strange poison increased to 99%. Cece ran up to the boy, worried about his condition. He frowned and said that he had been fighting for too long, so the poisoning had gotten worse and he could not stay here any longer. The warrior flew forward, thinking that without the protection of the sublime, the world of dragons and giants would fall apart. A powerful explosion could be seen in the distance. Cece stood next to a large blue window. Chinchu was lying on the rubble of the ground. The girl turned around and said that the door was closed. Suddenly, the boy coughed up blood. Red streams ran down his face. He said that once the door was closed, the connection with the other world was lost, and no one knew when it would open next. Cece ran up to her friend, who replied that everything was fine and that this was the price to pay for strength. He looked down and thought that although the blood explosion only seemed like an explosion of pure energy, only someone insanely strong could withstand it, and if a normal person used even the first type, their blood would evaporate in an instant, leaving only a desiccated corpse. The boy stood up and decided that he would need to increase his physical strength if he wanted to get to the third type. He took the girl's hand and said that they needed to rest, since the teleportation door had closed. In the ruins of the palace in the lands of the giants, a white demon lay. There were deep cracks on its arm. A huge hole gaped in its chest. There were thin scratches on its face. The monster stood up, looking at its hand. Its eye widened in shock. It stood up and stretched out all four arms to the sides. The man with black hair reported the location of the poison monsters into the microphone and requested artillery support. Many mutants were crawling on the mountains. Suddenly, shells flew from above. Loud explosions thundered. Seth touched the microphone and said that there were 6 minutes left until the next wave of gunfire. He hoped that this bunch of monsters would not escape. His colleague standing next to him replied that the monsters were eating their own corpses and were not moving from their place. Seth looked at Mark, who reported that the poisoning percentage was 15.5. The man frowned and said that they needed to hold out for another 8 hours. Seth looked straight ahead and said that it would be enough to drag everything back. The bald man slammed his palm onto his fist and said that the bodies of 7 level 5 monsters would cost a pretty penny, and even if they were wounded, they were worth a lot. Mark looked at the blue screen and said that they would need the money to increase their shooting power. He crossed his arms and added that if 3 of them remained, he would be happy. Seth frowned and said that, as they say in Country Z, consider yourself lucky. They watched the explosions, saying that if they didn't need the base's help, any one of these monsters at full health would have covered their needs. Seth smiled and said that it was time to get down to business and get these bodies out of the way. The man walked forward and added that they would take 3 bottles of cleansing energy and sell the rest. Seth smiled and said that 1 bottle was worth 200 million on the black market, so they would live like kings for a while. The demon stood in the middle of the fog. It was so huge that the soldiers looked like toys in front of it. Seth looked up in shock and opened his mouth. Gray smoke appeared next to the white monster. Mark frowned tensely, saying that the poisoning level was rapidly increasing. The 2 men turned around abruptly as the demon blew off the head of their colleague. Seth shook in horror, screaming that it was time to run. The monster crushed another man as Seth ran away at full speed. The demon watched the man. Its red eyes were wide. Blood spurted out of Seth's ears and eyes. Then there was a huge explosion, and more scarlet liquid flew around. Somewhere in the Apocalypse base in Country M, a rocket was rising into the air. The protagonist was lying in bed. He sat up and stretched. The guy knocked on the door and called Cece for breakfast. The girl came out of the room, rubbing her eye and asking for a hug from the student. He smiled and sighed. Then he knelt down and hugged the girl, asking what he should do with her. Cece closed her eyes and fell asleep on his shoulder. Suddenly, Chinchu heard a noise and frowned. A woman in a black leather suit was standing in front of the door. A delivery company's slogan was written on her back. Huangfu, with a black motorcycle behind her, announced the arrival of the delivery. The young man opened the door with Cece in his arms. The girl greeted the customer. He turned around, paying attention to the vehicle. Holding the little girl in his arms, the protagonist said that it was the first time he saw a delivery girl so early, and on a $100,000 motorcycle. Huangfu leaned over and replied that she had never seen anyone who lived in an expensive residence, and ordered delivery every day, and with a child. The student looked at the girl intently and said that he knew her too well. Suddenly, a dark red aura appeared around him. The bag fell from the delivery girl's hands. She trembled when she realized who was standing in front of her. Huangfu's cheeks turned red. She was very happy to see Chinchu with her own eyes. The guy frowned and asked what she was getting at. She unzipped her jacket and replied with a smile that she was here to stalk the boy. His eyes widened in surprise. The delivery girl turned away and confirmed that she wanted to stalk the protagonist. Walking up to the motorcycle, Huangfu said with a smile that she lived next door and said goodbye until the next order. He scratched the back of his head and said with a smile that his friend was straining himself too much, because there was a special investigation bureau in City N, and if the poisoning spread, they would rush here as soon as possible. The boy imagined dark silhouettes with red eyes. Likian raised his hand and replied that they were no match for Chinchu, and that he should not be responsible for anyone. He raised one eyebrow and added that this was why it was so important to know whose side you were on. The student looked at his acquaintance in confusion and asked what he was talking about. He smiled and said that after the news yesterday, most of the houses in the wilderness near that mountain had changed owners. He looked away and added that the main character was so famous that the value of the entire area had more than tripled, and all the rich people in City H were fighting to move here. Likian stretched out his arms and said that they were lying about needing help because they only wanted the student's resources and would give him anything for that. The young man frowned and asked his friend to help the rich people too. The young man touched his chin and thought about the resources. Likian closed his eyes and said that all these businessmen wanted to invite a local celebrity to dinner, that's why he came here. Chunchu smirked and said that he agreed. The young man patted his friend's hand and said that he had better keep his word and that they would see each other later at the best hotel in Linqiu. They stood in front of a luxurious house. Likian asked about Huangfu, and the protagonist replied that she came here for the sake of pursuit. The young man touched his chin and said that this girl might be a little domineering because she had gotten everything she wanted since she was young. The student looked closely at his friend who said that he should be careful because Huang Futai was behind Huangfu. He introduced the girl and the man who was the richest man in City H.